I stood on the corner of Monroe and LaSalle, the city wind cutting straight through my coat. Chicago in November has a way of reminding you how small you are. Glass towers all around, people walking fast, faces buried in scarves, each of them moving towards someplace warm. I wasn't going anywhere. I just stood there holding a cake box in both hands, trying to keep it level as the wind tried to take it from me. Before we continue, make sure to hit the like button. Also, tell us in the comments, what time is it where you are right now and which city are you watching from? I love seeing how far our stories travel. I'd baked the cake myself that morning. Chocolate, 2 layers, nothing fancy. My late wife used to make it every year for our son's birthday. I could almost hear her voice as I mixed the batter. Don't forget the pinch of salt, it wakes up the chocolate. She'd say it every time, even though I never once forgot. I suppose that's how love stays alive, in the things we keep repeating even when we don't have to. The building in front of me looked more like a mirror than a place where people worked. 40 stories of glass, with his name somewhere on the 33rd floor. Miller & Shaw Consulting. He was a senior partner now. That's what the receptionist had said last time I'd called. I didn't know what it meant exactly, but I knew it sounded important. Important enough that a father had to make an appointment to see his own son. He'd said he couldn't get away for lunch, but if I was nearby, maybe we could have a quick coffee downstairs. That was 4 days ago. I'd taken the train in early, found a bakery box that could fit the cake, and even bought a small candle. Just one because I figured at 38 he didn't need the whole set anymore. At noon I texted, "Here," just outside the lobby. The message stayed delivered, no reply. By 1 o'clock I was still there. People in suits came and went. The revolving doors spun endlessly, but not for me. My hands were starting to stiffen around the box, but I didn't want to set it down. Something about holding it made me feel like I still had a reason to be there. At 1:27 my phone buzzed. Finally, I looked down, already smiling, and then read the words. Dad, stop calling. No punctuation, no warmth. Just that. 4 words that somehow weighed more than the city skyline itself. For a long moment I didn't move. I watched a woman pass by with a coffee in each hand. A delivery driver cursed at traffic. Somewhere above I heard the hum of an airplane slicing through the clouds. Everything kept moving while I stood still. The phone felt heavier than the cake box now. I reread the message, hoping I'd missed something. A joke, a typo, maybe even a follow-up that hadn't come through. Nothing. Just silence. I thought about the last time we'd spoken properly. Not texted, not quick calls about bills or errands, but talked. It had been nearly a year ago at the cemetery. He'd stood stiff beside me, checking his watch between condolences. I remember thinking he looked too polished for grief, like he'd come from another world entirely. After that day, his messages grew shorter, less frequent, until there were none. Now this. Dad, stop calling. I looked at the cake box. The corners were damp from my grip. The little cardboard handle was starting to bend. I imagined him upstairs in some conference room surrounded by people who didn't know, or maybe didn't care, that it was his birthday. Maybe he didn't care either. Maybe that's why he wanted me gone. For a second, I almost went inside anyway. I pictured myself stepping through the glass doors, walking up to the reception desk, saying, "Tell him his father's here." But then what? A scene? A forced smile? A look of embarrassment? No. I wouldn't give him that. Instead, I walked to the bench near the corner, set the box beside me. The frosting had smudged slightly on one side. I'd checked through the small plastic window on top. I took off my gloves, rested my hands on my knees, and just watched people pass. A young man walked by holding his daughter's hand. She wore a bright yellow hat with a pom-pom that bounced with each step. They were laughing about something, probably something small, something silly. That kind of laughter only comes easy when life hasn't taught you to guard it yet. I sat there for another half hour. The wind picked up. I finally stood, picked up the cake and carried it to the trash can near the bus stop. I didn't throw it in right away. I hesitated. Maybe someone could use it, maybe the frosting would hold in the cold, but in the end I dropped it inside and watched the white box disappear beneath paper cups and old receipts. That was the moment it sank in. Not just that he didn't want the cake, that he didn't want me. On the train ride home, the city blurred by through fogged glass. My reflection stared back. A man who'd spent a lifetime teaching his students about history, about the mistakes people keep repeating when they forget where they came from. I wondered what lesson I was supposed to learn now. When I got home, the house felt larger than usual. The silence echoed in corners I didn't know could echo. I hung my coat, sat at the kitchen table, and scrolled through old photos. Birthdays from years past, my wife smiling beside him, flower on her hands, candles glowing. It all looked like someone else's life. I found the message again on my phone, just 4 words. But I couldn't delete them. Not yet. I needed to keep them to remember what love sounds like when it dies quietly. Without shouting, without drama, just a text on a gray afternoon. Outside, the first flakes of snow began to fall, tapping softly against the window. I stared until they blurred into streaks. Somewhere deep in me, a voice whispered, "Maybe this is how it begins, the part where you stop waiting." I didn't answer that voice, not yet. I set my mug down and let the warmth seep into my palms like an apology I hadn't earned. The kettle's whistle had long since stopped. The kitchen clock ticked in that precise, steady way it always did, once every second, steady as a metronome, the same sound my students once used to time their exams. I opened the photo app on my phone and let my thumb scroll. Image after image, paper hats, a crooked candle, my late wife laughing with frosting on her chin, my son's face luminous and a little wild, the kind of wild you only see when a child isn't thinking about a resume or a client pitch. Those were the days when his biggest worry was whether the taller kids were stealing the first slice. I tried calling him once on the train home. His voicemail was fuller than I expected, messages about meetings and a reminder from his calendar. Q4 review, 3 p.m. I listened to my own message from a year ago, a clumsy, loving thing. "Hey kiddo, cake in the freezer. Come by tonight if you can. Love you." I'd left it before bed after a day of grading papers and making pies the way my wife taught me. Back then he called back. We talked about nothing important for 20 minutes, the neighbor's dog, the way the leaves were finally doing what they should in October. It felt ordinary and therefore profound. Tonight it felt ordinary and therefore impossible. I composed a text on the bench by the train station. Nothing theatrical, just the kind of thing that might unstick a small moment between us. "Hey," I went home. "Cake didn't make it. Call me when you can." I stared at the unsent bubble, thumb hovering. A dozen versions piled up in my head. "Are you okay? I'm here. Sorry if I overstepped. Happy birthday anyway." Each one tasted like something I might regret, but each one also tasted like love. I saved them as drafts, one by one, like prayers folded into envelopes and tucked in a drawer. There's a strange arithmetic to loneliness. It accumulates silently, not like the tidy subtraction of bills, but in the small, unreturned things. Texts left unread, calls that go to voicemail, the absence of a name in the holidays family group chat. I'd never been the sort to keep score except in the way teachers do. Observing, noting, never making assignments out of affections. But tonight the score was written in the blank spaces on my screen and in the empty chair at my table. I remember the year he learned to ride a bike. My late wife and I stood at the curb with our breath clouding in the air, and he wobbled past us, cheeks pink with the effort of not falling. After he made that last triumphant turn down the block, my wife turned to me and said, "You'll see him fly and you won't even realize you're holding your breath." I believed it then. I didn't know you could keep holding your breath long enough to make your chest ache. The drafts on my phone were ridiculous in their politeness. "Hope your day went well. If you ever want to come by, there's soup in the pot. I still have your childhood scarf in the cedar closet if you want it. No pressure, love you." And then something sharper. "Why did you text me, Dad, stop calling?" And beneath it a small, meaner variant that I wrote and erased and rewrote. Was I too much? I read that one until the letters blurred. The thing about asking yourself whether you were too much is that it is rarely about the person who did too much, and more about learning to forget who you used to be. I kept 3 old voicemails in a little folder on my phone labeled him. I play them sometimes when I can't sleep. One is him at 8, breathless, telling me he'd been chosen for a summer program. Another is at 16, furious about a grade he thought unfair. He'd wanted me to plead his case. I'd made him learn to fight his own battles. And the last is quieter. After my wife's funeral, a small, unexpected conversation where he told me, "Dad, I don't know how to do this without her." He sounded young in that message, unprepared, like the child who still needed his coat tied. I listened to that voicemail and wanted more than anything for it to be the bridge back to him. Instead, it felt like a relic I'd polished until its edges wore thin. There are things you keep because they are yours, and things you keep because they are reminders. I kept those voicemails as both. Tonight I played them in the dark of my living room and felt the past press against the present, until I wondered whether continuity was a kindness or a cruelty. Did holding on to those recorded breaths keep me tethered to him, or did it stop me from seeing that he had drifted? I drafted an email next, less desperate, more practical. "I'd like to stop by this weekend. If you're busy, tell me an afternoon that works. I brought your jacket out of storage. Thought you might like it." I read it aloud. The way my voice shook when I read that small, reasonable sentence surprised me. I almost hit send, then remembered the text. "Dad, stop calling." I imagined the curt phrasing on a colleague's face, the tiny polite smile that says, "This is private." A man in a suit checking his phone under the conference table, slipping it back in, returning to the performance of being present. I thought of the photo I'd seen 2 months ago in a local magazine, him standing under an overwrought headline about young leadership. In the picture, he was in mid-laugh, head tipped back in a way he never did at home. At home, he laughed low near his chest. In the magazine, he laughed publicly for an audience. I kept writing and deleting. It was an odd kind of rehearsal, drafting versions of my own tenderness as if polish could make it less threatening. I wrote one that was all bluntness. "If you don't want to see me, say so. If you need space, I can do that. But if you want help, any help at all, I'm here." It felt like an ultimatum I didn't mean to make, like using a sledgehammer to open a jammed window. Between drafts, I'd find myself remembering small mercies. How he used to fall asleep in the back seat after a long day and how I would carry him inside, blanket tucked around his chin. How he learned to whistle on a summer porch and then taught himself to cook an omelet in college because he was tired of cafeteria eggs. I cataloged these things in my head like a curator preserving gentler artifacts. I was doing the work of someone who wants to understand what changed and who could not yet accept that maybe some things simply did. In the quiet of my kitchen, I opened his old school scrapbook, stickers, awards, that terrible 8th grade photo with the bowl haircut. and ran my finger along the taped edges of certificates. It felt comforting in the same way that a knot can feel comforting when you untie it with patience. I closed it and set it on the table with a small thump. The sound startled me, a household noise registering like an entrance. Later, when the snow began to come heavier and the lamps in my living room cast a low, forgiving glow, I finally sent one of the drafts, not the angry one, not the pleading one, but the simplest. Happy birthday. If you want to talk, I'm here. If not, I understand. Love, Dad. I watched the word delivered appear and then waited for the tiny ellipsis that might indicate he was typing back. For a human heartbeat, I imagined it. But the ellipsis did not come. There was only the white screen, a black cursor blinking at me like the metronome of some practice. That night I slept poorly. I woke at 3:14 a.m. to the sound of the radiator clunking. In the dark, I found myself drafting yet another message, this one to no one. Maybe it's my fault. Maybe I should have been different. But I am who I am. The truth of aging is knowing how little you can change at your core and how much you still want to. At 69, you recognize the shape of your hands, the way they tend to tremble, the way you still reach for the coffee mug exactly as you did when you were 40. It's both a consolation and a mournful surprise. In the morning, I walked to the corner bakery, bought a single roll, and sat on the bench outside my building looking at people who didn't know my story. There was a woman with a stroller smiling at an infant in a red snowsuit. A young man read a paper and cursed softly at the sports scores. Life continued, indifferent and stubborn. It felt almost cruel in its normalcy. I thought of the drafts on my phone, of the voicemails, of the birthday cake box in the trash. I thought of the drafts I'd never send, as though each unsent message was both a preservation of dignity and a wound I refused to dress. When I finally went to the kitchen, I found an old note tucked into the cookie jar, my late wife's handwriting, a tiny looping scrawl. Don't ever stop telling him happy birthday. Don't count what he gives in return. Count what you give instead. I pressed my palm to the paper until I felt the indented lines like a map. Her handwriting always felt like an argument for goodness. I'd kept that note not because it was wise, though it was, but because it was hers, and her small moralities had been the scaffolding of our life. So I wrote another message. Not a plea, not an accusation, just an offering. If you ever want the scarf, it's still in the cedar closet. It smells like him when he was small. Love you. I hesitated, thumb hovering, then tapped send. This one too showed delivered, and predictably the silence that followed was the loudest answer of all. I put the phone down, made my tea, and watched the steam curl and fade. There is a particular humility to watching your gestures go unanswered. You become both actor and audience to a drama no one else sees. But somewhere in that humility there is also a choice. To keep performing small acts of care even when applause is absent. Or to stop and save your energy for something else. Maybe for gentler radiance. Maybe for the quiet gardens of a life you still contend. Tonight, for the first time since the message, I did not erase any of the drafts. I left them like small offerings on my device, pieces of language that mapped the way my heart felt across a winter week. Perhaps someday one of them would find its way through. Perhaps not. For now they sat in my drafts folder, patient and undemanding, like a stack of unsent letters in a shoebox. I don't know which of those options is braver, persistence or retreat. What I do know is this: I still remember how to celebrate. I still know how to light a candle, and if someday he chooses to walk back into my life, there will be a place set at the table, a chair pulled out, and a slice of something warm waiting. If he never does, well, I will still have the cake recipes, the corny stories, the small domestic histories that stitch the house together. They are mine. They keep me steady. The neighbor's knock was soft, hesitant. Not the clatter of someone barging in, but the kind of knock that belongs to people who have lived next to you long enough to know where the thin spots in your life are. I opened the door with flour still on my palms. I'd been making a small loaf of bread because the house had felt unbearably empty, and bread makes a place feel like a place. She stood on the stoop with her coat buttoned up, cheeks pink from the cold, eyes the particular kind of worried that told me she'd had coffee and thought about it for a long time. "You all right?" she said before I could invite her in. She'd been the one who brought over a casserole the week after my wife died, the one who trimmed my hedges when snow made them droop. She'd always called me Elwood with the neighborly bluntness of someone who'd seen you fall and helped you up. I ushered her in and handed her a mug. She took it and wrapped both hands around it like it was a small island. "I read something," she said finally, "about your son." The cup paused at her lips. I didn't know whether to bring it up. I thought maybe it was none of my business. She set the mug on the table as if it suddenly felt heavier, as though the words themselves needed more surface to rest on. "You can tell me," I said. I realized my voice was calm. It surprised me. The parts of me that panicked had receded into something quieter. Not acceptance, not submission, but a space where I could hear things without them collapsing me. She reached into her bag and pulled out the folded magazine, its cover glossy and stark. My son's face in the center, the headline looping across the top in a font that seemed to declare victory. The new faces of leadership. He looked practiced in the photograph, a lean, bright smile that felt made for public consumption. I hadn't seen this magazine before. She said she'd found it at the grocery store, a display at the checkout, and had thought of me when she saw him on the cover. I told her to sit. My hands felt oddly small as I smoothed the magazine on the table. The photograph was familiar, and not at once. The same tilt to his head that always meant he was about to joke, but the background had been edited, the people cropped down to nothing. Whoever had taken that photograph, or whoever had chosen it for the cover, had decided this was a man who had no history in his smile. No father waiting on a bench with a cake, no woman beside him sewing birthday candles into place. In the sidebar, an excerpt of the profile read like a sermon for ambition. "I built this from the ground. I learned to hustle. There's no soft spot in my past that excuses me. You make your own fate." It was the kind of sentence engineered to play well at conferences and in profile pieces. Sharp, declarative, hollow in the places where mercy might be. "Did he know you saw it?" she asked. Her hands fidgeted with the napkin on her lap. "No," I said. "I haven't seen this." I couldn't make my voice sound smaller than it did. I flipped through the article. The writer had done a tidy job of erasing family. A paragraph about mentorship mentioned a mentor in Boston. Then the piece sprang into bullet points about growth strategies and the importance of image. Somewhere in the middle, a sentence praised his independent drive. There was a photograph of him at a charity gala with investors, shoulders pressed close to people who would appear on his LinkedIn for years to come. When neighbors notice things about your life, there's often a breadcrumb of guilt that follows. She hesitated, then told me what she'd also seen. A post on a community forum where someone had scanned the article and commented how self-made he was. And another commenter had replied, "That's the guy who never mentions family, so wonder why." The thread was polite in a way that was cruel. The kind of conversation that says, without saying, people are curated now. She'd saved the magazine because she thought I ought to know. Not because she wanted to hurt me, but because she couldn't ignore the shape of awkwardness unfolding so close to our door. I folded the magazine slowly, like one folds a handkerchief. There were small lines in the corner of the cover where it had been handled, a coffee ring half hidden on page 3. My son had been born in the small maternity ward in our town, wrapped in a blanket with a blue stripe, his first cries loud enough to make the nurse look up. I remembered the way his fingers had closed around mine in the dark of his first night at home. That microscopic memory pressed into me now with the weight of everything it had grown into. "You know," the neighbor said softly, as if she'd rehearsed these words on her walk over, "my sister had a boy like that, thought he was too big for the house after a time. Then he had his own child, and the first thing he did was bring that kid to the place where he grew up. Some people circle back, some don't." "Some don't," I echoed, and there was a cold certainty to the truth of it. That night I went looking. Not for my son, I knew where he worked, but for evidence that the public portrait matched the private one. I found an online profile, a string of curated images, a biography that read like a CV and not like the messy, grateful thing I'd write if I were to introduce him at a family dinner. He'd curated his past with surgical ease. Mentors listed, awards listed. Family mentioned only in the unavoidable line, "Grew up in the Midwest," which might as well be a postcard for someone who wanted to claim the land without the history. There was a photograph in a business blog where he'd spoken at a panel. He stood at a podium. Behind him, a banner was draped. In the program PDF, the kind of file no one reads unless they're in a hurry, the list of speakers included an affiliation line for him, but no mention of parents, no small hometown anecdote. He'd allowed himself to be reshaped into the kind of man who belonged to the glass towers and not to the small kitchen tables where his childhood had been seasoned. I felt the shape of betrayal not as a single sharp pain, but as a series of small, clean cuts along the places where my name had once fit into his sentences. It was not theft of money or property, it was something more intimate. It was being made invisible on purpose. There is a cruelty in erasure that's quieter than anger, and perhaps that's why it's so difficult to name. I went to bed that night thinking about the ways we excuse ourselves. Maybe he thought he was protecting me from being seen as a relic. Maybe he thought my presence would damage his trajectory. Or perhaps he thought nothing at all. Perhaps he had simply decided that the parts of him that made people uncomfortable needed to be tucked away. I could find reasons. Finding them did not make the wound smaller. Before sleep, I wrote a short note and left it on the kitchen table under the fruit bowl. Nothing accusatory, too much pride for that. Just 2 sentences. "I saw the article. I read you there. I will come by the office one day this week to say hello if you are free. If you are not, I will understand." It felt like offering a hand across a gap and also like staking my own dignity. I would not vanish because someone else preferred me to. The neighbor left before dawn with a thermos and a promise to check in. I went to the kitchen window and watched fog curl along the rooftops. In the washing out gray of the city morning, I realized something I'd known in a way that did not hurt. The public is a dangerous place when it chooses to forget you. It's a place where images are made to be admired and not to be complicated. What I had to decide now was whether I would allow the public portrait to rewrite my son's story, or whether I would learn to tell my own. It was the 3rd morning since I'd read that article, and the house hadn't warmed once. The heater rattled, then fell quiet again like it was tired of trying. I'd kept myself busy with pointless rituals, rinsing mugs that were already clean, rearranging books, refolding the same sweaters in the hallway closet, because if my hands were moving, maybe my thoughts would slow down. They didn't. The magazine sat on the kitchen counter, folded open to my son's smiling face. I'd tried turning it face down, but somehow the paper had a way of catching the light so that it gleamed through the pile of unopened mail. His smile was the first thing I saw every time I walked past. I'd thought of throwing it out, but that felt cowardly, as if discarding the proof might undo what was written there. By the time afternoon came, the sky had turned the color of old pewter. I poured myself coffee, sat at the kitchen table, and opened the drawer beneath it, the one I hadn't opened in years. It was the drawer of things you keep because you're not ready to admit they still hurt. Envelopes from old holidays, sympathy cards, recipes written in my wife's looping handwriting. The smell that came out was faintly of cedar and thyme. I shuffled through the papers until I found a small envelope, yellowed along the edges with my name written in her hand. Elwood. For later, when you need it. I'd seen it before, a few weeks after her funeral. I couldn't open it then. Later had felt far away, but the room was too quiet now, and later had finally come. I carried it to the living room, sat in my armchair, and turned it over once, twice, feeling the indentation of her pen beneath my thumb. Then I broke the seal. Her handwriting danced slightly across the page like her voice used to when she was trying not to cry. If you're reading this, it means you've done what good men do. You've waited too long to let yourself feel things. I smiled without meaning to. That was exactly how she would have started. You were always patient, even with pain. You carried it like something that could be managed, catalogued, stored in some drawer until it stopped mattering. I loved that about you, but it worried me too. Our boy has your heart, Elwood, and that's both a blessing and a curse. He's got the same stubborn pride, the same need to fix things alone. One day you'll want to rescue him from himself. Maybe you already have. When that day comes, remember this. Love isn't about rescuing, it's about standing still and letting them swim back on their own. I paused, letting the words settle. My throat ached. If you try to hold him too tightly, he'll call it pressure. If you stand too far away, he'll call it neglect. You won't win either way, so just be there quietly until he looks back. That's when you open your arms, not before. I stared at that line until the words blurred. She'd written it like she'd known this moment would come. As if she'd seen the text message, the magazine, the shame of being erased. The thought made something inside me crack open, not in anger this time, but in grief so quiet it almost sounded like peace. I read the rest slowly. Promise me you'll keep baking the cakes even if nobody comes to eat them. Promise me you'll keep saying happy birthday even if the only person who hears it is the air. That's how we keep love alive, not through applause but through persistence. By the time I reached the end, the ink had smudged where her tears must have fallen. Or maybe mine were joining them now. I folded the letter carefully and held it against my chest for a long while. Outside, the wind pressed against the windows like it was trying to get in. The house creaked, the kind of small, familiar noise that comes from wood remembering it's alive. I thought about how many times I'd mistaken silence for punishment. Maybe it wasn't punishment at all. Maybe it was just waiting. I stood and went to the kitchen. The air smelled faintly of flour and dust. I found her old recipe book, the one bound with a blue ribbon, and opened to the page titled, "For Him Every November." My son's cake recipe. I read it through slowly, tracing her notes in the margins. Too dry if baked too long. He likes extra frosting. The simplicity of it broke me. How something so small could outlast a lifetime. When I was done, I washed my hands and preheated the oven. It wasn't his birthday anymore, but that didn't matter. Some traditions weren't about the calendar. They were about remembering who you promised to be. The batter came together easily, muscle memory guiding me through. When I poured it into the pan, I realized my hands weren't shaking this time. I didn't check my phone. I didn't think about whether he'd ever eat it. I just baked, quietly, with the letter propped up against the sugar canister like a photograph. As the smell filled the house, I finally understood what she meant about standing still. Loving someone didn't mean waiting by a phone. It meant holding a space for them, and for yourself, even when they'd forgotten where home was. When the cake cooled, I cut a single slice and placed it on her china plate. Steam curled upward, soft and sweet. I carried it to the small table by the window and sat there with it, letting the city darken outside. Somewhere out there, my son was probably in a restaurant, surrounded by noise and people, his face lit by screens. Maybe he was laughing, maybe not. Either way, I whispered it quietly to the empty room because she'd told me to. "Happy birthday, son." Then I added something I hadn't said in years, though I wasn't sure who I was saying it to. Him, her, or maybe just the universe itself. "I'm still here." I left the house before sunrise, the letter folded in my breast pocket like a secret heartbeat. The wind off the lake was sharp enough to make my eyes water. Maybe that was mercy, a built-in excuse for the tears I didn't intend to shed. The trains ran quieter at that hour, and the city for once seemed half asleep. Each streetlight blinked at its own pace, slow and patient, as if to remind me that the world keeps time even when we fall out of step with it. The building where my son worked looked different in the dawn. The glass didn't glitter now. It only reflected the weak blue of morning. I stood across the street for a minute, looking up at the 33rd floor, counting the windows like a man taking attendance. I don't know what I expected to see. Him at a desk, maybe, or the faint shape of someone pacing. Nothing moved, just my own reflection in the glass. The receptionist wasn't the same woman I'd met last time. This one was young, brisk, efficient, her voice smooth with the kind of politeness that draws a boundary before you even cross it. "Good morning," I said. "I'm here to see Mr. Miller, his father." She blinked, glanced at her screen, and then at me. "Do you have an appointment, sir?" "No," I admitted. "He'll want to see me." The lie came easier than I expected. "I'm sorry," she said. "Mr. Miller's in meetings until afternoon. Would you like to leave a message?" I looked at the clipboard on her counter, the neat list of names and times. The entire morning was filled with people who did have appointments. I wanted to tell her that I'd once been the man who packed his lunches, who taught him to tie a Windsor knot for his first interview, who stood in a cold gymnasium cheering at graduations. But she was just doing her job, and those details would mean nothing to her. They probably meant nothing to him anymore either. "Tell him I stopped by," I said. I reached for a scrap of paper and wrote, "Just wanted to see you. Hope you're well. Dad." The word Dad looked awkward in my own handwriting. Too big, too certain. I folded it once and left it on the counter. Outside, the cold had deepened. I turned up my collar and started walking toward the river. Every few steps I checked my phone, half hoping for a call, half dreading it. By the time I reached the bridge, there it was, a voicemail notification. My stomach clenched before I even played it. His voice was smooth, professional, each word measured. "Dad, I got your note. Please don't come by the office again, okay? It's just not appropriate. We'll talk sometime soon, I promise." A pause, just long enough to sound polite, then quieter. "You don't have to keep showing up. I'm busy." That was all. The message ended with the hum of background chatter and then silence. I stood on the bridge and listened again, this time through the small speaker pressed to my ear as if repetition might reveal some hidden kindness. It didn't. The tone wasn't cruel exactly, it was worse than cruel, it was indifferent. For a long time I stayed there watching the water move beneath me, slow and dark. The wind smelled faintly of diesel and cold iron. Every few minutes a truck passed behind me, shaking the railing. I thought about throwing my phone into the river, about letting it disappear into the current. But I didn't. You don't throw away the only thread you have, even when it burns your hands. Instead, I walked, one block at a time, until the city began to wake fully. Coffee carts opened. People hurried past. and I found myself standing in front of a park I hadn't visited in years. I sat on a bench and pulled out my wife's letter. The creases had softened from the warmth of my pocket. I read the line I'd memorized already. Love isn't rescuing. It's standing still and letting them swim back on their own. I whispered it under my breath like a prayer and felt something in me settle. Not healed, not fixed, but quieter. A shadow fell across the bench. I looked up to see my neighbor wrapped in a wool scarf, holding 2 cups of coffee. "I figured you'd be out here," she said, handing me one. "You always walk when you're trying to think." I nodded, grateful for the interruption. She sat beside me, knees touching the edge of the bench. We talked about nothing for a few minutes, the weather, the rising cost of groceries, until finally she asked, "Did you see him?" I told her about the voicemail, about the word appropriate, and how it stuck in my throat like a pebble. She shook her head. "Some people build whole fortresses around their guilt," she said. "You can't knock them down from the outside." I smiled a little. "You sound like my wife." "Smart woman," she said, sipping her coffee. Then, after a moment, "What will you do now?" "Bake another cake, maybe. Keep the lights on. Be here." I looked toward the skyline, the sun finally catching on the top floors of the buildings. She told me to stand still. The neighbor placed a hand on my arm, gentle but firm. "Standing still doesn't mean standing alone," she said. "Come by for dinner sometime. You don't have to wait for him to remember you to be part of someone's life." When I got home that afternoon, the house felt less like a museum and more like a story still being written. The magazine was gone from the counter. I'd slid it into a drawer with the letter, not to forget but to keep. I made soup, simple and warm, and let it simmer while I read through an old stack of my wife's recipes. Her handwriting curled across the pages like vines. At the bottom of one she'd written, "Serve with company, even if it's only yourself." As the light faded, I checked my phone one more time. No new messages. I deleted his voicemail, not in anger, but because I didn't need to hear the distance anymore. Then I sat by the window, bowl in my lap, and watched the city lights come on one by one. They looked like small candles in the fog, reminders that even in all this cold, somebody somewhere was home. I thought about what might happen if he did call one day. If he came to the door, awkward and uncertain. Would I be ready? I think I would. Not because forgiveness comes easy, but because waiting without bitterness is its own kind of grace. For now, that would have to be enough. When I finally went to bed, I whispered the same words I'd said over the cake. "I'm still here." The house answered with its usual creaks, familiar and faithful. For the first time in weeks, I slept without dreams. I'd started setting the table before noon, even though I told myself not to. Old habits have their own logic. They move you like tide water. The tablecloth came out of the drawer, creased from disuse, the same one my wife had embroidered our 2nd year of marriage. I laid out 2 plates, polished the cutlery until my reflection bent in the metal, and set the roast to slow cook until the whole house smelled of rosemary and heat. It was December and the windows showed their breath. I wasn't expecting him to come. Not really. I'd sent the invitation the night before, short and almost formal. "Dinner tomorrow if you're free. No speeches, no questions, just food." I watched the message turn blue and stopped myself from checking again. The oven's ticking clock filled the room. When twilight arrived, the streetlights made long shadows across the porch. I poured myself a glass of water, sat down at the table, and listened to the wind nudge the siding. Then the sound came. A car door, a quick shuffle of steps on the porch, the faint hesitation of someone deciding whether to knock. My chest tightened. 3 soft raps against the door. I opened it to find him there, wrapped in a coat too thin for the weather, collar up, eyes darting past me to the interior of the house. He looked smaller than he did in the magazine photo. tired in the way that ambition eventually makes you tired. Hey, he said as if testing the word. Hey yourself, I managed. I stepped aside. You're right on time. He nodded, stepped in, and the warmth hit his cheeks with color. His gaze fell on the table. 2 plates, 2 glasses, the kind of setup that admits to hope. You really went all out. I remember how you liked it, I said. Your mother's recipe. We sat, and for a moment the only sound was the scrape of chairs. He reached for the napkin, folded it into a smaller square, unfolded it again. The small, restless motions of someone who doesn't know how to sit with silence. This looks great, he said finally. You didn't have to. I did, I interrupted gently. You're here. That's reason enough. He glanced at his phone, screen lighting his face blue, then dimming again. I can't stay long, There's this dinner thing downtown. Of course, I said. There's always something downtown. He winced a little. Dad, I read the article, I said before he could find his apology. You looked confident. It was just PR, he said quickly, a practiced smile. They write those things how they want. And the part about being self-made? He sighed. You know how they spin it. No one wants to hear about family in those pieces. It's just branding. Branding, I repeated, tasting the word like something spoiled. That's what we are now? He set his fork down with a quiet click. It's complicated. You wouldn't understand how this world works. Maybe not, I said, but I do understand how gratitude works. His face flushed. I didn't mean to erase you, but you did. He looked at me then fully, eyes glassy with a mix of anger and shame. I didn't want to be pitied. Everyone in that office comes from nothing or pretends to. You think they'd take me seriously if I talked about growing up in a house where my dad taught history and made me sweep the sidewalk on weekends? That house paid for your degree, I said quietly. Those weekends taught you to finish what you start. He shook his head. I just needed to be someone else for a while. And did it work? I asked, are you someone else now? He didn't answer. The roast steamed between us untouched. Outside, snow started to fall, tapping the windows like polite fingers. After a long pause, he said softer, You shouldn't have come to the office. I know, I said, but fathers do foolish things when they miss their children. He looked down at his plate. His voice came smaller now, uncertain. You make me feel guilty. That's not my goal. Then what is? To feed you once more before we forget how. He stared at the roast, then at the wall behind me, anywhere but at my eyes. When he finally spoke, the words were raw. Every time I come here, I feel like I'm 16 again, like I never grew up. I smiled, sad and genuine. That's the curse of parents. We remember you as you were. You remember us as we've aged. He exhaled hard, pushed his chair back and stood. I should go. I nodded. At least take something with you. There's pie cooling by the window. He hesitated in the doorway, hands deep in his coat pockets. You still make the crust from scratch? Always? He gave the smallest smile, the kind you could miss if you blinked. Save me a slice, maybe next week. Maybe, I said. He left before I could find a better word. Through the window, I watched him cross the yard, his shoulders hunched against the cold. The taillights flared red, then disappeared down the street. The house fell silent again. I sat back at the table, the second plate still full, steam rising faintly into the dim light. I thought of my wife's letter, stand still and let them swim back on their own. Maybe this was him turning in the water, not yet coming home, but not lost either. I covered his plate with foil, placed it in the refrigerator and turned off the dining room light. The smell of rosemary lingered. Before bed, I looked out at the snow settling on the porch, the single trail of footprints leading away. I whispered, Drive safe to the empty night. It had been 3 weeks since that dinner. The foil-covered plate in the refrigerator had long since been emptied, but the space where it sat still carried the faint scent of rosemary and apology. The days had turned cold again, the kind of cold that makes windows sing when the wind pushes against them. I'd stopped checking my phone every morning, though I still caught myself glancing at it when the floorboards creaked, as if a vibration might be hiding somewhere in the silence. Life settled into small, deliberate motions. I swept the porch, repaired the hinge on the kitchen door, even bought a new bulb for the lamp in the study. The one that had flickered for months but never quite gone out. There's something comforting about maintenance. It's a way of keeping the world from unraveling completely. The neighbor had stopped by once with a casserole and a story about her sister's dog. We talked for an hour about nothing, which was its own kind of medicine. She didn't mention my son, and I didn't bring him up. That was the kindness between us. We left space where pain might breathe. Then came that evening. The light outside had turned copper, the sky bruised with winter's first serious snow. I was in the kitchen pouring hot water over a tea bag when I heard it. A knock, soft and uncertain, like someone testing whether they were still welcome. For a moment I thought it might be the neighbor again. But something in my chest knew better. I wiped my hands, walked to the door, and opened it. He stood there, his coat dusted with snow, a paper bag in one hand, the other shoved deep into his pocket. His hair was uncombed, his face drawn, but his eyes, they were the eyes I remembered from before the world taught him to hide behind them. "Hey," he said quietly. "Hey," I answered. "Cold out." "Yeah." He looked down at the step, at the familiar doormat with my wife's faded embroidery. "Welcome home." He smiled faintly. "You still have this old thing?" "She made it," I said. "I never saw a reason to change it." He nodded, then held up the paper bag. "I brought something. Don't get too excited. It's just pie, from that bakery near my office." "I'm always excited for pie," I said, and stepped aside. "Come in before you freeze." He hesitated, just for a breath, then crossed the threshold. It was the smallest act of courage I'd ever witnessed, and somehow the bravest. The house was warm, heavy with the smell of the soup I'd made earlier. He glanced around as if the walls might look back at him. "Looks the same," he said. "I try not to change much." He set the bag on the counter, pulling out a small box tied with twine. "I wasn't sure if you still liked apple." "I still do." We stood there, two men separated by everything unsaid. The silence wasn't hostile now, just fragile, like thin glass waiting to decide whether it would hold or shatter. "Listen," he began, then stopped. His shoulders sagged. "I've been thinking about that night." "So have I said. He exhaled through his nose, eyes fixed on the floor. "You were right. I erased you. I thought it was easier that way. I thought people would respect me more if I looked like I'd built myself out of nothing. But when I saw that article again, when I read what I'd said, it didn't feel like me. It felt like something hollow wearing my face." I said nothing. I'd learned that sometimes silence is the only safe ground for truth to land on. He looked up then, his voice lower. "I'm sorry, Dad. I don't even know if that word covers it, but I am." The apology didn't sound rehearsed. It sounded like exhaustion turned into honesty. I nodded slowly. "You don't have to fix it all tonight," I said. "You just have to mean that." "I do." I motioned to the table. "Sit down. The tea's still hot." He did. I poured 2 cups, the steam rising between us like a soft barrier that slowly began to fade. He reached for the sugar jar, my wife's old porcelain one, and turned it in his hands. Mom always said this was too fancy for everyday use. She did, I said, smiling despite myself. But I never listened. He stirred his tea and let the spoon rest against the rim. The clink of metal against china felt like the sound of something mending. I miss her, he said. I do too, I whispered. Every day. We drank in silence for a while, watching the snow gather outside. The house seemed to breathe again. Floorboards settling, the clock ticking, the kind of noises that belong to the living. After a while, he said, I've been thinking about making some changes. Stepping back from work for a bit. Maybe I'll teach guest seminars. Something that feels real again. I couldn't help but laugh softly. Like father. Like son. He grinned, embarrassed. Guess it's in the blood. For the first time in years, the sound of his laughter didn't feel like a stranger's. It filled the room with something that had been missing. Not joy exactly, but possibility. He stayed longer than I expected. We ate the pie cold from the box, talking about nothing urgent. His car needing new tires, the neighbors' stubborn hedges, the new coffee shop downtown. When he finally stood to leave, he paused at the door. I'll come by again, he said. Maybe next Sunday. I'll bake, I said. Chocolate cake. He smiled, the small, crooked smile he had when he was 10. Don't forget the pinch of salt. My throat tightened, but I managed to nod. Never have. He pulled his scarf tighter and stepped into the snow. The streetlight caught the flakes swirling around him, and for a moment he turned back, just to wave. It wasn't grand or cinematic, just the kind of wave that says, I see you. I remember. Then he walked into the soft blur of evening until he was gone. I closed the door and stood for a long time in the quiet. On the table, 2 empty cups sat side by side, a faint curl of steam still rising from one. I touched my pocket, feeling the folded letter still there, the one that had guided me through the cold. I whispered, He's swimming back, love, just like you said he would. Outside, the snow kept falling, but it didn't look lonely anymore. It looked like grace. Slow, quiet, and enough. If this story touched you, don't leave just yet. Take a moment to share it with someone who might need to hear it tonight. And if you've ever waited for a call that never came, tell me in the comments how you found peace. Your stories matter here more than you think. I'll see you in the next one.